Welcome to today's exploration into the source material. We've all had those moments, right, where someone is just pushing your buttons, making demands, or just being a total nuisance. But at what point does, just being a jerk actually become a crime?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Exactly. So today we're diving into your shared source material on the Philippine Revised Penal Code to figure out exactly where the law draws that line. Our mission is to walk you through this whole spectrum of threats and the specific legal mechanics of coercion. Basically, we want to see how the legal system tries to keep us from just taking the law into our own hands.
It's really all about the social contract. I mean, these laws exist so we don't end up in this sort of might makes right world. We're looking at Articles 282 through 289 today, which basically serve as the ultimate rule book for how we're allowed to influence each other.
Let's jump into the heavy stuff first. Grave threats. Looking at Article 282, this isn't just about being mean, it's about that if-then logic. Like if I tell someone, drop that lawsuit or I'll burn your house down.
Yeah.
That feels like the absolute peak of the spectrum.
It is, because you're threatening a crime arson, in this case, to force someone to do something. But the law gets very specific about the outcomes here. There are three forms. If you make that threat and the person actually drops the lawsuit, that's the most serious form. Goal achieved.
And if they don't back down?
You're still in trouble. That's a failed threat. And honestly, even if you just say, I'm going to burn your house down without demanding anything at all, you've still committed a grave threat because you've shattered that person's sense of security.
Okay, so the threat itself is the poison. But here's a weird one from Article 283. What if the thing I'm threatening isn't even a crime? Like the example in the source, pay me 1,000 pesos or I'll report your tax evasion to the BIR. Reporting taxes is a civic duty. How is that a light threat?
Because you've put a price tag on it. If you just report them, you're a whistleblower, doing a good deed. But the second you use that information to extort money, you're weaponizing the law for your own gain. It's the demand, not the act of reporting, that turns it into a crime. That's what makes it coercive.
Oh, I gotcha. It's the difference between doing the right thing and running a protection racket.
Precisely.
Now, I want to bridge this over to doing, rather than just saying. There's a taxi driver example in the source that really blurred the lines for me. He threatens to crash the car and kill everyone unless the passenger goes to a nightclub with him. He hasn't touched her, but he's controlling her.
That's the perfect bridge to grave coercion under Article 286. People often think violence means physically hitting someone, but in legal terms, a display of force that overrides your will is totally enough.
So like physically blocking someone.
Yeah. If a very large person stands in a doorway, blocking your exit without saying a single word or touching you, that is coercion. They are physically preventing you from doing something you have a right to do, which is leave the room.
So it's about the loss of autonomy. I noticed the source also calls out creditors who get a bit too aggressive. Like if someone owes you money and you just go to their house and
grab your laptop as payment.
Right. Which you can't do.
Absolutely not. Even if they legitimately owe you the money, you cannot use violence or intimidation to seize property. That's like coercion. The law essentially says, go to court, don't go to their living room.
Let's talk about the catch-all that seems like it could apply to almost any bad neighbor. Unjust vexation. The source says it's for conduct that unjustifiably annoys an innocent person without using violence. That sounds incredibly broad.
It's the most common charge we see precisely because it's the everything else category. It's for when someone isn't necessarily threatening your life, but they are consistently disturbing your peace in a way that has no legitimate purpose. A judge has to decide if the annoyance is unjustifiable, though.
Which keeps it from being used for every tiny little grievance. We also have these specific protections in the workplace, Articles 288 and 289. It's a crime for a boss to force employees to buy stuff from their own company store or to pay wages in tokens instead of legal tender.
It all goes back to preventing individuals from abusing power. Economic bullying, basically. And if someone is a repeat offender, the court has this really interesting tool called a bond for good behavior under Article 384.
I love the description. That's like a legal security deposit. Right?
Exactly. The court says, put up this money. If you stay peaceful for a set period, you get it back. If you harass this person again, we keep the cash and you go to jail. It's a direct financial incentive to stay civil.
It's a fascinating system, distinguishing between a heat-of-the-moment outburst and a calculated attempt to override someone's will. But here's a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If unjust vexation covers anything that unjustifiably annoys another person, Where do you draw the line in your own daily life?
That is the big question.
Right. At what point does a persistent salesperson or a noisy neighbor stop being a simple nuisance and start becoming a legal liability? Think about that next time you feel vexed. Thanks for joining us for this exploration.
You know how it is. You get into a heated argument and things get said. But have you ever wondered where the law draws that line? I mean, the line between just blowing off steam and actually committing a crime? It's a lot blurrier than you might think. So today, we're going to break down exactly where that legal line is drawn.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. Picture this. Someone gets right up in your face and yells, "I'll make you pay for this." It definitely feels threatening, right? No doubt about it. But is it actually illegal? Like, could that person end up in court for saying that? Well, that question is the perfect place to start because it gets right to the heart of this whole thing. The thing is, in the eyes of the law, just saying that, well, that phrase on its own isn't quite enough. To cross that line from just an angry outburst into an actual prosecutable crime, a threat needs to have a few key ingredients. So let's take a look at the recipe, shall we?
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with what actually makes a threat criminal. Then we'll dive into the whole spectrum of threats, from the really serious ones to the lighter stuff. After that, we'll see what happens when things cross the line into coercion. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at why we even have these laws in the first place. Sound good? Let's go.
Okay, first up, what are those key ingredients that turn a bunch of angry words into something the law actually calls a criminal threat?
So the core of it, the absolute essence of a criminal threat is one word: intimidation. See, it's not just an insult, it's a promise to inflict harm in the future. And that harm isn't just physical. It could be directed at a person, their property, or even their reputation, what the law, in its fancy way, calls their honor. Right, but here's where it gets interesting. The law doesn't just lump all threats together. Nope, it actually puts them on a spectrum, from the most serious stuff, called grave threats, all the way down to what are known as light threats.
So what's the big difference? Honestly, it's surprisingly simple. It all boils down to just one question. Is the thing you're threatening to do also a crime? Think about it. If you threaten to murder someone or burn down their house, well, murder and arson are obviously crimes. That makes it a grave threat. But what if you threaten to do something that's not a crime, like, say, reporting them for tax evasion? That's perfectly legal to do, and that's what makes it a light threat.
But wait, there's more. Even within the category of grave threats, the law gets even more specific. It breaks things down based on two things. Was there a demand involved? Like, give me money or else. And did the person actually get what they wanted? So if someone makes a demand and succeeds, that's form number one, the most serious. If they make a demand but fail, that's form number two. And if they just make a threat with no demand at all, that's the third and least serious form of a grave threat. And here's a perfect real-world example of a light threat. This is classic blackmail, really. See, the act of reporting someone for dodging their taxes isn't a crime. You're allowed to do that. But the second you attach a demand for money to it, the moment you say, "Pay me or I'll report you," that's when you've crossed the line. That's the crime. And you know what? The law is actually pretty smart about human nature. It recognizes that sometimes people just snap. They lose their temper. That's where this other category comes in, other light threats. This basically covers those outbursts made in the heat of anger, especially if the person doesn't keep it up. They say something stupid, then they calm down and don't persist with it.
Okay, so that's the world of threats, which, if you notice, are all about something that might happen in the future. But what happens when that intimidation isn't about the future anymore? What happens when it's happening right now? Well, that is when we cross a really important line, from making threats to the crime of coercion. Okay, so this is the absolute key difference. Listen up. Threats are all about the future. It's, "I will hurt you if you don't do this." See, it's conditional. Coercion, on the other hand, is happening in the present. It's immediate. It's, "I am hurting you right now until you do this." That tiny shift in timing from will to am, that changes everything legally.
All right, let's dive into our fourth section, coercion and something called unjust vexation. And just like with threats, you're going to see there's a spectrum here too, from really serious force all the way down to some acts that are, well, surprisingly minor. So at the top of that spectrum, we have grave coercion. This is the big one. It's when someone uses violence or just the threat of it to do one of two things. Either compel you to do something against your will, or, just as important, prevent you from doing something you have a legal right to do. At its core, it's about one person completely overriding another person's free will through force. And get this, it doesn't have to be actual physical violence. The law is super clear that intimidation is enough. I mean, check out these examples from actual court cases. In one, a taxi driver who just threatened to crash his car unless his passenger went to a nightclub with him, that was ruled coercion. Or how about this one? Just surrounding someone with what the court described as a notoriously threatening attitude was enough. Seriously? No punch ever has to be thrown.
Okay, then we move all the way down to the other end of the scale, and we find this, well, it's a fascinatingly broad category called unjust vexation. The legal definition is basically any human conduct that, while not physically harmful, unjustly annoys or vexes an innocent person. Think of it as a legal catch-all for any kind of behavior that seriously disturbs someone's peace of mind.
So when you hear a legal term that vague, unjustly annoys, you have to wonder, right? What in the world could that possibly include?
Well, you might want to sit down for this one. According to actual case law, even an unwanted kiss, provided it wasn't lewd or lascivious, can be considered unjust vexation. How about that? It's a perfect example of something that doesn't cause a physical injury, but you can bet it unjustly vexes the person who didn't want it.
Okay, so we've looked at all these incredibly specific definitions and all these fine lines the law draws, which brings us to the most important question of all. Why? Why bother with all this detail? Let's zoom out and look at the big picture.
Really, why bother distinguishing between a threat made in the heat of the moment and one that comes with a demand? What's the point of all these different categories and subcategories? What is this all for?
Well, here's the answer, and it's fundamental. It all comes down to one bedrock principle of any functioning society, that no one gets to take the law into their own hands. It doesn't matter how right you think you are. We are a government of laws, not of men. We're governed by rules, not by the force of whoever is strongest or angriest in the moment. So in the end, all of these careful, sometimes nitpicky distinctions, they're all there for one reason, to protect the very fragile line between our personal freedom and pure intimidation. They make sure our words and actions have consequences, but that those consequences are measured and fair. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. In our world today, with all its online arguments, its heated protests, and high-stakes confrontations, where do you see these lines being tested every single day?
Welcome back to the deep dive. We spend a massive amount of our time, our daily lives, worrying about these huge abstract concepts. We worry about the economy. We stress over global politics. We're doom scrolling about the state of the world.
The big picture stuff.
The big picture stuff. But today, I want to invite you to zoom in, way, way in. We're going to be wrestling with something that feels incredibly big when you say the words, but is actually intimately small in practice. We are talking about your personal liberty and your security.
And just to be super clear right off the bat, we're not talking about this Statue of Liberty holding a torch kind of liberty. This isn't constitutional law or voting rights or, international treaties today.
No, not at all. We are talking about the messy, gritty, everyday legal line that separates just being a difficult person or an angry person from actually being a criminal.
Yeah.
We're talking about that exact moment when an angry word becomes a weapon, or the moment someone tries to, hijack your free will. It's a very specific and, like you said, a very intimate boundary.
It's a fascinating area of the law. It really is.
Right.
Because we tend to think of crime as these big explosive acts,
Yeah.
robbery, murder, arson. Those are the ones that make the headlines.
Right.
But the source material we are covering today, and it's technically titled Crimes Against Personal Liberty and Security, Chapter 2, Section 3 of the Revised Penal Code. It deals with the spaces in between. It deals with words. It deals with fear. It deals with the psychological cages that people can build for one another.
I was thinking of it as the Peace of Mind Protection Act. That's what it feels like.
That's actually a perfect way to frame it. The law explicitly recognizes that you can destroy a person's life without ever laying a finger on them. You can do it with a threat. You could do it with a display of force. You could do it by just paralyzing their ability to choose. So this whole section of the law is trying to guarantee that you can walk down the street or sit in your house or go to work without that constant fear of future harm and without being bullied into doing something you don't want to do.
And the sources for today, they are wildly specific. I mean, I was reading through the case notes and it felt like I was reading a script for some kind of drama anthology. It was unbelievable.
Some of them are pretty out there.
We have cases involving taxi drivers who are basically holding their passengers hostage for a date. We have people threatening to burn down houses for, 500 pesos?
A huge sum at the time, but yeah.
And we even have a case, and I cannot wait to get to this one, involving a marriage proposal at gunpoint.
Which, and this might be a spoiler alert for the listeners, is not considered a romantic gesture in the eyes of the court.
No, definitely not. So here's the mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack how the law actually draws these lines. We need to understand the difference between someone just blowing hot air and someone making a grave threat.
Right.
We need to understand coercion, which I love that phrase you used, the theft of willpower. And we need to see how these old laws apply to the messy reality of human relationships, today.
It's really a study of human behavior. It asks us to look at that very blurry line between just anger and actual criminality.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty, because the specifics are where this gets really good. We have to start with the heavyweight champion of this whole section, grave threats. In the legal text, this is Article 282.
Right, Article 282. Grave threats. This is the foundation for a lot of what follows.
Okay, so for the layperson, for me, and probably for a lot of people listening, when I hear the word threat, I think of any time someone says something mean or scary. If a boss says, I'm going to get you fired, or a friend says, I'm not inviting you to my party, or a stranger on the street says, I hope you trip and fall. Are those grave threats?
Generally, no. And this is the absolute first major insight we need to nail down. To commit the crime of grave threats, the offender has to threaten someone with a wrong that itself amounts to a crime. That's the first hurdle.
Right.
So you have to be threatening to kill someone, which would be homicide or murder. You have to be threatening to burn their house down, which is arson.
So you're threatening a felony, basically.
Exactly. You have to be threatening to kidnap them, which is illegal detention. Or you have to be threatening to hurt their physical body, which would be physical injuries. The threat itself has to be a promise to commit a recognized crime.
So the content of the threat has to be illegal in itself. That makes sense.
Precisely. If I say, I am going to stop being your friend, it hurts your feelings, but ending a friendship isn't a crime. Therefore, threatening it isn't a grave threat.
It's just mean.
It might be mean, it might be socially aggressive, but it's not a felony. But if I say, I am going to break your legs, well, breaking someone's legs is definitely a crime. And that pushes us squarely into the territory of Article 282.
Okay, that is the baseline. But the law is never that simple, right? The notes, they break grave threats down into 3 distinct forms, all based on this idea of conditions. And this is the part that, to me, reminded me of a hostage negotiation movie. It's all about leverage.
It is very much like a negotiation, just a criminal one. The severity of the punishment, it actually changes based on whether the threat has strings attached. We call these conditional threats.
All right, so let's break that down. Let's look at Form 1. This seems to be the most serious version.
This is indeed the most serious. This is the one that carries the heaviest penalty. It's when you threaten a crime, let's stick with the example, burning a house down, and you demand money or you impose some other condition, give me $1 million or I burn the house.
That's classic extortion. It feels very, very straightforward.
It is. But here's the nuance that catches people off guard, and this is where it gets really, really interesting from a legal perspective. The condition itself doesn't have to be illegal.
Wait, hold on. Walk me through that, because usually we think of the bad guy asking for something bad, give me the secret codes or something.
Not necessarily. And this is where we look at the case that's mentioned in the source material, a case from Reyes. This is a classic law school example. In this scenario, the offender threatened to kill the victim, unless the victim agreed to marry the offender's daughter.
The shotgun wedding. Literally.
Literally. Now, stop and think about the condition for a second. The condition is, marry my daughter. Is it illegal to ask someone to marry your daughter?
No, of course not.
No. Marriage is a lawful social institution. It's perfectly legal to get married. In fact, society generally encourages it.
But it's very illegal to force it.
Exactly. And that's the point. The law says, I don't care if the condition is lawful. I don't care if you are demanding they donate to charity or sing a song or marry your daughter. If you are using the threat of a crime, in this case homicide, to force that condition, you are guilty of grave threats. You're hijacking their agency. That's the crime.
That makes perfect sense. It's the method, not the goal. You can't use a gun to force someone to do something, even if that something is, I don't know, give a hug or eat your vegetables.
Correct. The crime lies entirely in the imposition of the will through the fear of a serious crime.
Okay, so now let's contrast that with a condition that is about money. This brings us to another case in the files, U.S. versus De La Cruz. This one feels very cinematic, almost like a Western or a period piece.
It's a very evocative case. We are in a different era here, for sure. You have an offender who approaches an old woman. He threatens her with death. Specifically, he says he will burn down her house and kill her unless she hands over 500 pesos.
Which I'm guessing at the time was a fortune. That's not just pocket change.
A life-changing sum of money for her? Absolutely. And the key here is that clean transaction. Give me the money or the house burns. This illustrates the demand for money element perfectly.
No, in the notes, it mentions that the penalty shifts depending on whether the guy actually gets the money. This seemed a little odd to me at first. If I threaten you, isn't the crime already done? Haven't already broken the law?
Yes. And this is a really crucial distinction in criminal law. The crime of grave threats is considered consummated, meaning it is finished, it is complete, and it is punishable. The absolute moment the threat is made and the victim knows about it.
So the fear is the key.
The fear has been instilled, the peace of mind has been shattered, the crime is done.
So if the old woman says no, or if, the police jump out of the bushes and tackle him before he gets the cash, he's still guilty.
Absolutely. 100% guilty. Whether or not he gets the 500 pesos doesn't change the fact that a crime occurred. However, if he does get the money, if she hands it over out of fear, the penalty is higher because he attained his purpose.
It's like a bonus penalty for success.
In a way, yes. You can think of it like that. Attaining the purpose is what's known as a qualifying circumstance. It makes the punishment worse, but the crime itself is already on the books the second the fear is instilled.
Okay, so that's the conditional threat. Do this or else. And Form 1 and Form 2 in the tech just cover whether you get what you want or not. But what about the threat where there's no demand? Where I just say, I am going to kill you, and I walk away. No demand for money, no marry my daughter, just pure malice.
That is the third form of grave threats. It's a threat without a condition.
Yeah.
And because there is no condition, there's no way for you to buy your way out of the threat. It's treated very, very seriously.
It seems more direct somehow.
It is. But the legal bar for proving it is actually quite high. The prosecution has to prove a deliberate purpose to create that fear. It can't just be an outburst.
Okay, and that's a good segue. It can't just be an outburst. This brings us to a really tricky concept you mentioned earlier, something called the absorption rule.
Yes.
This sounds like something from a biology class, but you said it's vital for understanding how the law counts crimes.
It is. Let's walk through it. Imagine a robbery. A guy points a gun at you and says, "Give me your wallet or I'll shoot."
Standard, terrifying scenario.
Right. Now, technically, he is threatening to kill you. That fits the definition of a grave threat. But he's also robbing you.
So does he get charged with robbery and D-threats? Is that two separate crimes?
Usually no. In that scenario, the threat is absorbed into the robbery. The law reasons that intimidation is an inherent ingredient of robbery.
You can't really rob someone without scaring them, right?
Exactly. It's part of the package. So the threat is just the tool that's used to commit the robbery. The formal charge would be robbery with intimidation. One crime.
So it's like how you don't charge a chef separately for the flour that's in the cake. It's just part of the cake.
That is a great analogy. The threat is the flour. The robbery is the cake.
Yeah.
But, and here's the deep dive nuance, there is a very important exception. And that's if the threat is distinct and separate from the main crime.
Okay, so give me an example of a distinct threat. How do we unbake the cake? How do we separate the flour?
Let's use the same robbery scenario. I rob you, I take your wallet, the robbery itself is over. You're standing there shaking. I start walking away. But then I stop, I turn around, I walk back to you and I say, and by the way, if you call the police, I know where you live. I will come back and burn your house down next week.
Oof. That feels totally different. That feels like a whole new chapter of terror.
It is different.
Yeah.
That threat isn't about getting the wallet anymore. You already gave that up. That threat is about ensuring future silence. It has a different purpose. It's a separate act of intimidation.
I see.
In that case, the courts would very likely charge me with robbery and grave threats because the threat stood on its own legs. It wasn't just a tool for the theft. It was a tool for impunity.
Wow. So context is absolutely everything. The timeline matters. The purpose matters.
Always. Law is almost always about context and intent.
Okay, let's pivot now to the next tier down. We've done grave threats threatening actual crimes. Now we have light threats. This is Article 283. And this sounds like, diet threat, but when you actually read the details, it covers something we all know by another name: blackmail.
That's right. Light threats are fascinating because they deal with this gray area of morality versus legality. The absolute key distinction here is that the act being threatened is not a crime.
Okay, I need an example. If I'm not threatening to kill you or burn your house, what am I threatening to do that still scares you enough for it to be illegal?
The classic example, and the one that comes up most often, is threatening to expose a secret or a personal weakness.
Okay.
Let's say, you're having an affair. Now, having an affair might be immoral, it breaks your vows, it might ruin your divorce settlement, but me telling your spouse about it isn't a crime. It's just gossip or, truth-telling, depending on your perspective.
Right. You have a First Amendment right, or just a general free speech right to tell the truth. I get to tell your wife you're cheating. I can tell your boss you're lazy. I'm allowed to say those things.
Exactly. But if I come to you and I say, I'm going to tell your spouse about the affair unless you give me 10,000 pesos, now we have a huge problem.
Because you're monetizing the fear of the truth.
Precisely. You are now demanding money or imposing a condition. Even though the act itself, telling the spouse, is perfectly legal, using it as leverage to extort money from you turns it into a light threat. This is the legal definition of blackmail in this specific context.
There's a case in our stack that fits this absolutely perfectly. People versus Haweho, the tax evader. And this one really twisted my brain a bit because it involves threatening to do something that is technically a good deed.
This is a great one for illustrating the principle. So in this case, the offender threatens to report a person to the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the BIR for tax evasion.
Which, arguably, that's a civic duty. We should be reporting tax evasion. If you see something, say something, right? The government actually wants us to do this.
In theory, yes. Reporting a crime is a legal and even a laudable act. But this offender demanded 1,000 pesos to not report it.
Pay me, or I called the tax man.
Exactly. The court looked at that and said this was a light threat. The threat was to do something legal, report a crime to the BIR, but because it was coupled with the demand for money, it became a crime itself. The demand for money infects the whole interaction. It turns a potential civic duty into a common shakedown.
Now, here is the loophole that just blew my mind, and I want the listeners to really pay attention to this because it reveals so much about how the law works. What if I just hate you? What if I find out you're a tax evader and I come to you and I say, I know you're a tax evader and I'm going to tell the BIR, and I don't ask for money. I just want you to suffer. I want to see you go down.
Then, legally speaking, regarding threats, you're in the clear. Article 283 specifically and explicitly requires a demand for money or some other imposed condition.
That feels wild. So I can terrorize you with the threat of exposure as long as I don't ask for a penny. I can make your life a living hell just for my own satisfaction.
It feels counterintuitive, I know. But think about the alternative. If we made it illegal to threaten to report a crime, period, then no one could ever say, stop stealing from the register or I'll call the police.
Oh, good point.
That statement, stop or I'll call the cops, is a threat. It is a threat to expose someone. But it's a lawful threat because you aren't asking for personal gain. You're asking for the law to be upheld.
So the crime is in the hush money, not the threat of exposure itself.
Correct. It is the extraction of value from the fear that the law punishes. It's the commodification of the secret. That's what makes it blackmail.
Okay, that makes sense. Moving on to Section 3 of our outline. This is, I have to admit, my favorite part because it feels the most human. It's the heat of anger defense. This is Article 285.
This creates a lot of debate in legal circles, and it's a fascinating area. This article covers what are called other light threats. It includes things like threatening someone with a weapon during a quarrel, or, as you said, threats made in the heat of anger.
The weapon rule seems pretty straightforward. If we're arguing about a parking spot and I pull a knife, even if I don't lunge at you, that's a crime right there.
Yes. Drawing a weapon in a quarrel is a specific crime under this article, unless it's clearly in self-defense. It just automatically elevates the danger level of any conflict. You've introduced a lethal element into a verbal argument. The law wants to discourage that kind of escalation at all costs.
But the heat of anger phenomenon is the one I really want to dig into. Because we have all been there. You're driving, someone cuts you off, and you yell at your windshield, I'm going to kill you. Or you're in a heated fight with a sibling or a partner, and you scream something terrible that you take back 2 minutes later.
The law recognizes that humans are emotional creatures. We say things we don't mean when our cortisol is spiking. And so we have distinct legal categories for cold, calculated malice versus hot, reactive anger. There is a specific legal distinction for threats made in the heat of anger.
So how do I prove I was just hot-headed and not actually making a grave threat? What separates a common tantrum from a felony?
There are three main elements that the court is going to look for. First, the offender must be undeniably angry, has to be a genuine emotional outburst. Second, they threaten a crime like, I'll kill you. But third, and this is the absolute most important part, they do not persist in the idea.
Do not persist. That is the key phrase. So I have to say it and then just calm down. Is that it?
Basically, the subsequent acts matter more than the words themselves. If you scream, I'll kill you, and then you storm off, go have a beer, maybe call them later and apologize and never mention it again, the law is going to treat that as a light threat, not a grave threat. It judges the intent and the reality of the danger posed to the victim.
We have the case of the apologetic husband in our notes here. U.S. versus Estrada. This story is, well, it's intense. It really highlights how the courts look at timelines.
It is the absolute textbook example. So a husband gets into a violent verbal quarrel with another man. In this fit of rage, he screams that he's going to kill him. And he doesn't just say it, he runs home to get his revolver.
Whoa, okay, that sounds like persisting to me. He went to get a gun. That's not just words anymore, that's taking a step.
It certainly looks like it at first, and it's a very dangerous step. He comes back with the revolver, he's actively looking for the guy, but the other man had, very wisely, hidden himself. So finding no one to shoot, the husband starts to cool down, the adrenaline fade.
Right.
Later, he actually goes and begs the man for pardon. He says, look, I didn't mean it. I was just seeing red. I lost my head.
And the court bought that, even though he went and got a gun.
They did. The court ruled that this was a light threat under Article 285, not a grave threat.
Simply because he apologized.
It's not just the apology. It's the entire sequence of events. His later actions showed that he didn't actually plan to carry it out. He didn't hunt the guy down the next day. He didn't set a trap. He had an outburst, a very, very dangerous one involving a firearm. But he didn't persist in the idea once that initial wave of anger had faded.
I just find it kind of funny that I didn't mean it, I was just mad is a valid legal classification. It feels like something a toddler says after breaking a toy. It was an accident.
It does feel a bit childish, I agree. But think about the alternative. If every single time someone lost their temper and yelled an empty threat, we charged them with a grave felony, half the population would be in prison. The law is trying to distinguish between a conditional threat, which is cold, calculated extortion, and a heat of anger threat, which is an emotional failure, but is usually far less dangerous in the long run.
So the law is giving us a little pass for being human, as long as we fix it quickly.
A small pass. Let's be clear, it is still a crime. You will still get punished. But you don't get the heavy, heavy sentence that comes with a grave threat. It's a pragmatic recognition of human frailty.
Fair enough. Okay, let's shift gears entirely now. We are leaving the world of threats, which is all about future harm, and we're moving to coercion, which is about controlling someone right now in the present moment. This is Article 286, grave coercion.
This is where the law gets very physical, or at least the threat of the physical becomes immediate. Coercion is defined as preventing someone from doing something lawful, or compelling them to do something against their will by using violence or intimidation.
Stealing willpower, that's the phrase from the reading that really stuck with me.
That is a perfect description. Unlike a threat, which usually says, do this or I will hurt you tomorrow, coercion says, I am forcing you to do this right now. The timeline collapses.
And the key ingredient here is violence or intimidation. But the notes are very clear that this doesn't always mean physical touching. You don't have to beat someone up to coerce them.
No, you absolutely don't. Intimidation, a credible display of force, is more than enough. And we have the case of People versus Raimondo, the taxi driver case. This one is genuinely terrifying because it's such a vulnerable situation that so many of us have been in.
Right. You're trapped in a moving metal box with a stranger, so set the scene for us.
A taxi driver has a female passenger. He decides for whatever reason that he wants her to go to a nightclub with him. She obviously refuses. She just wants to go to her destination.
As you do.
As you do. So he threatens to crash the car. He says he will kill both himself and her if she doesn't agree to go to the club.
Wow. And he didn't touch her. He didn't hit her.
The record doesn't show any physical battery. He didn't have to. He turned the car itself into a weapon. He used the display of force, the credible immediate threat of a high-speed crash, to control her will. The court said this absolutely counts as violence for the purpose of coercion. He was compelling her to do something against her will by creating an immediate life-threatening situation.
It's psychological violence, but with immediate physical stakes. It's not a future threat, it's a present one.
Absolutely. The law recognizes that fear can be just as paralyzing and controlling as ropes or chains. If I'm standing here with a grenade and I pull the pin, I'm not touching you, but I'm most certainly coercing you.
Now, surely there are times when you are allowed to stop someone from doing something. You know, if I see a toddler running into traffic, I'm going to grab them. That's coercion, technically, right? I'm using force to prevent a lawful act walking.
Technically, yes, you are using force to prevent an act, but the law is built on exceptions and common sense. We call this the right to coerce in certain limited circumstances. Society functions because we allow certain people in certain roles to use authority.
Okay, so who has this right? Who gets to coerce people?
Parents, for one. A father preventing an unemancipated son, a minor, from leaving home to join a gang or just to run away. The law grants parents the authority to discipline and protect their own children. So grounding your kid isn't a crime, it's parenting.
Phew. That's good to know. Millions of parents just breathed a sigh of relief.
Then you have the concept of self-help. This is for property owners. If someone tries to illegally enter your land or take your property right in front of you, you can use reasonable force to prevent it. You can block the door, you can push them back, you have the right to exclude people from your home.
And I saw one in the notes about safety. A doctor restraining a patient.
Yes, the case of U.S. versus Calvo. In that specific case, a doctor forced a cholera patient to leave a house to prevent the spread of a deadly disease. Or a more common example, think of a police officer restraining a criminal. If the coercion is done for the safety of the public or the person themselves, and you have the legal authority to do it, it's not a crime. It's a necessary exercise of power.
There's one specific type of coercion mentioned in the notes that feels very relevant, not just historically, but to society today. Religious intolerance.
This is a specific qualifying circumstance. This means that coercion is considered worse, it gets a higher penalty, if the motivation behind it is to prevent the exercise of religion.
And the case for this is U.S. versus Morales, the procession.
Right. This was a direct conflict between two faiths in a town. Yeah. You had a Catholic procession moving down the street. Candles, statues, prayers, the whole ritual, and members of a different faith, the Anglican Church, in this specific record, forcefully disbanded the procession.
They physically broke up the parade.
Yes, they used force to stop the religious ritual because they believed their faith should be the only one that predominated in that town. And the court came down hard on them. It was ruled as grave coercion. You were preventing people from doing something lawful, exercising their religion through violence. The law protects the right to believe and the right to practice that belief from mob rule. It's really an early form of hate crime legislation in a sense.
That's a great way to put it. Now, it's interesting how coercion sits so close to other crimes. It feels like a chameleon crime. Sometimes it looks like kidnapping. Other times it looks like assault. How do we tell them apart? This brings us to Section 5, the fine lines.
The fine lines. This is where law students usually get a massive headache. And it's all about intent, the purpose of the act. Let's start by looking at coercion versus illegal detention.
Okay, so detention means locking someone up, confining them.
Right. But why are you locking them up? That is the million-dollar question for the court. If your primary goal is just to confine them, to deprive them of liberty, to hold them in a room, it's illegal detention. But if the confinement is just a method to force them to do something else, then it's coercion.
Okay, I need a case study. Help me visualize this difference.
The perfect case is U.S. versus Cousy. You have a suspected thief. The police, or people acting like police, they drag him out and they start beating him up. They're holding him against his will. But the reason they're holding him isn't just to keep him in a room. They're beating him to get him to confess. They want him to sign a paper or admit to the crime.
So because the goal was the confession.
It's coercion. The restraint, the confinement, it was all just a tool to break his will regarding the confession. If they just thrown him in a basement and left him there for a week with no demands at all, that would be a classic case of illegal detention.
That's subtle, but I see it now. It's all about the end game. What are you trying to achieve?
Exactly. Now, what about the difference between coercion and this other very strange-sounding crime? Unjust vexation.
Unjust vexation sounds like a crime my little brother commits on a daily basis.
And it kind of is. Unjust vexation is a catch-all term in the Penal Code for behavior that annoys or vexes or torments someone, but lacks the specific violence or grave intimidation of coercion. It's the creepy or seriously annoying zone of criminal law.
And the case for this is the kissing case, People versus Calamico. This one felt very uncomfortable to read.
It is uncomfortable. A man grabs a girl, holds her tight, and kisses her. Now, the court looked at all the evidence and found that there were no lewd designs, meaning it wasn't an attempted rape or what they'd call acts of lasciviousness in a sexual sense. Maybe it was just a terribly misguided, unwanted romantic gesture.
But she definitely did not want it. She was being held against her will.
No doubt about that. But was it coercion? Did he force her to do something specific, like sign a document or go somewhere? Not really. Was it lasciviousness? The court said no lust was proved. So it falls into this category of unjust vexation. His actions caused annoyance, distress, and a disturbance to her mind.
It feels like a bit of a slap on the wrist for grabbing someone.
It is a lighter penalty for sure. But it's important because it acknowledges that you have a right not to be vexed or harassed, even if the aggressor's intent doesn't fit neatly into the bigger, more serious crime boxes like rape or coercion. It catches the behavior that might otherwise slip through the cracks.
There's one more fine line that I think is really important, especially for anyone listening who owes money. The creditor exception. This is Article 287.
Ah, yes. Light coercion. This is a very specific and very common scenario. Imagine you owe me $1,000. You refuse to pay. So I come to your house, I punch you in the nose, and I take your TV to cover the debt.
That sounds like robbery to me. You beat me up and you took my TV.
It looks exactly like robbery. I use violence, and I took your property. But in the crime of robbery, the intent must be intent to gain, taking something that isn't rightfully mine. Here, my intent is to collect a debt. I honestly believe that the value of that TV belongs to me.
So I can't be charged with robbery because I didn't have the right criminal mindset.
Correct. You didn't have intent to gain in the specific criminal sense. You had intent to collect. But, and this is a huge but, you can't just go around beating people up to collect your debts. That's vigilantism.
So what is the crime then? If it's not robbery, what is it?
The law created a special category for this. Light coercion, under Article 287. It specifically punishes creditors who use violence to seize property from a debtor. You aren't a robber, but you are a light coercer. You took the law into your own hands.
The lesson there is pretty clear. Use the small claims court, don't use your fists.
Exactly. The legal system hates it when citizens try to be the police, the judge, and the jury all at once. It creates chaos.
Okay, we are entering the final stretch here. Section 6. We're moving from the street and the home and into the workplace. And this section feels very Dickensian, the company store, Article 288.
This takes us right back to the history of the labor rights movement. Article 288 punishes employers who force their employees to purchase merchandise from them or from a specific person.
Right, the old, I'll hire you, but you have to buy your lunch from my cafeteria and your work boots from my brother-in-law's shop.
Exactly, and often at wildly inflated prices. This was a common tactic in old mining towns or on remote plantations to keep workers in a state of perpetual debt. You earn $1, but you owe the company store $2 by the end of the week.
It's a trap.
It is. And the article also explicitly mentions token wages.
Paying people in tokens or company scrip instead of real money.
Yes. Here is a coin that is only good at the company store. It absolutely destroys the economic freedom of the worker. You can't save, you can't spend your money elsewhere, you can't build up enough cash to move. You are effectively owned by the company. Article 288 makes that a specific form of coercion.
It's amazing that this is grouped right in here with threats. It really is a threat to someone's entire livelihood.
It is economic violence. It limits a person's liberty just as much as a locked door does. If you have no money to leave, you are, for all practical purposes, a prisoner.
And finally, labor disputes. Article 289, this deals with unions and strikes.
The law tries to strike a balance here. It protects the right to strike and the right to organize. But, just like with the right to coerce, there are lines. Peaceful picketing is legal. You can hold signs, you can chant, you can try to persuade people not to cross the picket line.
There's always a but.
But you cannot use violence or threats to stop others from working. The case of People versus Carballo is cited here. Strikers stopped a truck driver. They didn't just stand in front of him with signs. They threatened him. They told him that he wouldn't be hurt if he went their way.
And the clear implication there being, he will be hurt if he doesn't.
Exactly. That crosses the line from peaceful picketing into coercion. You are compelling the driver to stop against his will through the use of fear. The law is trying to balance the right to protest with the right of other people to move freely and to work.
It's always a balancing act, isn't it? Your right to swing your fist ends exactly where my nose begins.
That's the oldest legal maxim in the book, and it applies perfectly to this entire chapter of the law.
So, to recap, we have traveled from the heat of anger in a traffic jam to a marriage proposal at gunpoint, all the way to the company store paying workers in tokens. It is a lot of ground to cover.
It is. But if you zoom out from all the specific cases and articles, there's a central theme that ties it all together.
And what's that?
Civilization. I mean, that's what it is. The law is an attempt to civilize conflict. Human beings are, by nature, aggressive. We want what we want. We get angry. We want to force other people to agree with us or give us things. These laws, threats, coercion, unjust vexation, they're the guardrails, they say. You can be angry, you can be owed money, you can even hate someone, but you cannot use fear or force to solve those problems.
You have to use the courts, you have to use words, but not threatening words.
Right. These laws, at their core, protect our peace of mind. They protect the will. Because without free will, without the basic feeling of safety, liberty is just a word on a statue. Real liberty is the ability to sit in your own home without worrying that someone is going to burn it down for 500 pesos.
That is a really powerful takeaway. The law protects the space inside our heads just as much as it protects the space inside our homes.
Well put.
Before we go, I want to leave the listener with a final thought to chew on. The source material mentions a penalty, an old one, called a bond for good behavior. It's an old concept. Basically, you have to put up money to promise you won't be a jerk again.
It's a classic deterrent. Put your money where your mouth is, literally.
So in our modern world, we deal with a lot of threats and coercion that don't look like these old cases. We have online harassment. We have cancel culture mobs that can feel a lot like coercion. We have digital blackmail. We have doxing, where someone's address is put online as a threat.
The violence of the digital age. It's often bloodless, but incredibly damaging.
Exactly. So here's the question. If we were writing these laws today, what would a bond for good behavior look like for the internet? Does the law need to evolve to define violence in a space where no one ever touches you, but millions of people can attack your will all at once?
That is the question of the century, isn't it? When does a tweet become a grave threat? When does an online campaign of harassment become grave coercion? The principles in these old cases, intent, persistence, the shattering of peace of mind, are the only tools we have to figure it out. But applying them to a viral mob is a challenge that the original authors of this code could never have possibly imagined.
Something to mull over the next time you're typing a furious comment in the heat of anger.
Indeed. Maybe count to 10. Do not persist in the idea.
That's very good advice. Stay cool, everyone, and thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Welcome to The Debate. There's that old childhood rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Legally speaking, well, that is a complete lie. Today, we are stepping into the really precarious territory of personal security and liberty. We're dissecting the exact moment where a word stops being just an expression of anger and becomes a criminal weapon.
And where the assertion of one's rights crosses the boundary into coercion. It's a fascinating and often messy area of law because it deals so heavily with the intangible, fear, the human will, and, the chaos of emotional outbursts. We're looking specifically at Articles 282 through 289 of the Revised Penal Code.
Precisely. The central question we're debating today is how the law really distinguishes between words that terrify, which we classify as threats, and acts that control the will, which we call coercion. I'll be representing the perspective that the severity of these crimes lies in the intent to intimidate and the imposition of conditions. The law, in my view, is primarily designed to protect the sanctity of a person's peace of mind.
And that's where I come at it from a slightly different angle. I believe the law ultimately prioritizes the means and the result. So I'll be arguing that the more substantive violation is the actual restriction of freedom, coercion, and that many acts which, you might classify as grave threats are often legally mitigated by an offender's emotional state or are simply absorbed into other crimes entirely.
So let's begin with the concept of the threat itself. When we look at Article 282, grave threats, we're dealing with a crime that strikes at the very core of psychological security. The law defines this as threatening another with inflicting a wrong that amounts to a crime, be it on their person, honor, or property, and coupling that with a condition.
But the wrong has to amount to a crime, correct? I mean, you can't be charged with grave threats for threatening to fire an employee or sue someone, because those are legal acts.
Exactly. It has to be a crime like death, injury, or arson. But here is where I take a very strict stance. The gravity of this offense is not necessarily about whether the offender actually carries out the threat. It's about the condition imposed. If I threaten to burn your house down unless you give me money, or even unless you do something legal, like, say, marry my daughter, I have committed a grave threat. The presence of that condition turns the threat into a tool of leverage.
Even if the condition itself is legal.
Yes, that's the crucial insight. The act demanded, marrying the daughter, is perfectly legal, but using the threat of arson to force that act is the crime. The Supreme Court has been very clear on this. In People versus Villanueva, the ruling established that the crime is consummated the moment the threat comes to the knowledge of the person threatened.
Meaning the victim simply has to hear it.
Correct. Whether the offender actually gets the money or, the marriage is irrelevant to the existence of the crime. The damage is the fear. The fear is the violation.
I see why you emphasize that, and in a vacuum, I'd agree. But let's look at the practical reality here. You mentioned Villanueva and the idea that just the knowledge of the threat completes the crime. I'm not convinced, however, that every terrifying statement holds that kind of legal weight. If we look at the broader context of criminal law, threats are often just the mechanism for other offenses. This is the concept of absorbed crimes.
You're referring to complex crimes where the threat is a means to an end.
Exactly. Take U.S. versus Sevilla. The offender threatened to kill the victim if his lost jewelry wasn't returned. Now, on paper, that sounds exactly like your grave threat with a condition, but the court viewed it through the lens of that specific interaction. Or look at People versus Timble. If a threat is used to commit robbery or rape, the threat it disappears as a separate legal entity. It's absorbed. The law recognizes that the threat is merely a tool. If I point a gun at you to rob you, I'm not charged with grave threats and robbery. I am charged with robbery with intimidation. The threat is subservient to the act.
That is a fair distinction when it comes to complex crimes, but I think it creates a dangerous blind spot. It minimizes the harm of the threat when it stands alone. You're focusing on the physical act that follows, but Article 282 exists because the fear is the damage. The law punishes the deliberate purpose of creating that fear. In U.S. versus Pudgegarigan, the court emphasized this deliberate intent. If I methodically plan to terrify you, to destroy your mental peace so that I can control your behavior, that is a completed evil regardless of whether I rob you or not. The psychological siege itself is the crime.
Deliberate purpose. That is the key phrase, isn't it? But this brings us to the messiness of human emotion, which I think is where your strict interpretation starts to fall apart. We have to talk about the heat of anger, because let's be honest, people say terrible things when they're mad, things they don't mean.
I suspect you're referring to Article 285.
I am. Article 285 covers other light threats, and this is the law's acknowledgement of human fallibility. If an offender in a fit of rage yells, "I'm going to kill you," but doesn't persist in that idea, it is not a grave threat. It's a light threat, and the penalty is significantly lower.
I see the logic, but I do worry about the loophole it creates. There's a danger in allowing "I was just mad" to become a blanket defense for terrorizing someone.
It's not a blanket defense, but it is a necessary distinction. Look at People versus Untalon or U.S. versus Estrada. In Estrada, the accused threatened to kill the victim during a quarrel. He even went home to get a revolver.
Wait, he went home to get a revolver? That sounds like preparation to commit the crime.
It does, but later he cooled down. He didn't come back shooting. In fact, he actually asked for a pardon. The court held this to be a light threat. And why? Because he did not persist in the idea. The lack of deliberate purpose matters. The law forgives the outburst if it isn't sustained. It acknowledges that a hot-headed scream is different from a cold-blooded plot.
That's a valid point on persistence. But I want to contrast Estrada with another case that shows exactly where the line is drawn. Consider People versus Tonko. In that case, the threat was also made in a sudden flare of anger, very similar to your example. The offender yelled, "I will shoot you."
Okay.
But then he added, "if you do not leave."
The condition.
Exactly. The court ruled that even in the heat of anger, if a condition is imposed, the nature of the crime shifts back toward grave threats. The imposition of a condition, do this or else, implies a level of cognitive control that overrides the blind rage defense. It shows the offender is lucid enough to formulate a transaction, your safety in exchange for your compliance.
That is a very subtle distinction. So you're saying the moment I ask for something in return, I can no longer claim I was just blindly angry.
Precisely. The anger defense can't stand when the offender is rational enough to use fear to manipulate the victim's will. And that brings us back to my core thesis. The law hates the leverage more than it hates the noise.
It is a compelling argument. But that concept of manipulating the will, that transaction you describe, is exactly why we need to distinguish this from coercion. You're focused on the words used to manipulate. I'm focused on the restriction of the will itself. Article 286, grave coercion, is about preventing another from doing something not prohibited by law or compelling them to do something against their will using violence or intimidation.
So we're moving from the threat itself to the act of control. But isn't coercion just a threat that has moved into the physical realm?
Not necessarily physical. And this is where the nuance really lies. Coercion requires violence or intimidation, yes, but how we define those terms changes everything.
Violence usually implies physical force.
Usually. But in U.S. v. Zaballero, the court found that a mere loud voice demanding property wasn't enough to constitute the violence required for coercion. You can scream at someone to give you their wallet, but if you aren't displaying material force, it might not be coercion.
I'm not entirely convinced by that because violence in the context of coercion is often interpreted pretty broadly. It doesn't always require a punch or a weapon.
I agree. It doesn't require touching. And this is the scary part. Take People versus Raimondo. This is the taxi driver case. The driver threatened to crash the car, killing himself and his passenger if she didn't go to a nightclub with him.
That is terrifying.
It is. But look at the mechanics of it. He didn't touch her. He didn't pull a knife. He didn't lock the doors in a way that physically bound her. But the court ruled this was coercion. Why? Because the threat of crashing the car operated as intimidation, sufficient to control her will. It wasn't just a threat, it was the active compulsion of her behavior through an imminent display of force. He was weaponizing the car itself.
That actually supports my view that the psychological impact is paramount. The violence there was the fear of death used to steer her actions. In fact, the line between coercion and illegal detention is often where the psychological element is most tested. You cite Raimondo as coercion because he controlled her destination, but consider U.S. versus Quevenco.
The case of the servant girl?
Yes, this one is haunting. A servant was compelled not to leave a house. Now, she wasn't physically locked in a room. She wasn't tied up. She technically had the freedom of the house, so to speak.
So she could walk from the kitchen to the living room, but not out the front door.
Right. But she believes she couldn't leave. The court ruled this was grave coercion. And why? Because her will was controlled. The violence was the psychological barrier that her master constructed. This proves the law focuses on the psychological chain, not just the physical one. If I can shackle your will without even touching you, I have coerced you.
I accept that interpretation. But notice the distinction the court made. They specifically ruled it wasn't illegal detention. If they had followed your logic that the peace of mind is the total sum of the crime, they might have treated it as a deprivation of liberty in the absolute sense, kidnapping or illegal detention. Instead, they categorized it as coercion, a crime against the will. It reinforces that coercion is about the specific act of compelling or preventing behavior, distinct from just holding someone captive.
It is a fine line, but an important one. Which brings us to a very common scenario where people believe they are justified in compelling behavior. We see this all the time in business or personal disputes. The so-called right to compel.
Ah, yes, the creditor who decides they're tired of waiting for their money. Vigilante justice.
Precisely. Under Article 287, we have light coercion. The law frowns very heavily on what we call taking the law into one's own hands. even if you are truly owed money, even if you have a contract signed in blood, you cannot simply walk into your debtor's house and seize their television.
I have to clarify the mechanism here, though. The method is everything. If the creditor uses violence to seize the property, it is coercion, no doubt. But what if they use deceit? What if they use stealth?
If they use violence, it is certainly coercion. The law penalizes the method.
But this is where the means matters. If I trick you into giving me your car to pay a debt, or I take it when you aren't looking, I haven't used violence or intimidation. Therefore, it can't be coercion. It falls under the second paragraph of Article 287, unjust vexation, or perhaps theft, depending on the intent to gain. But specifically regarding debt, People versus Reyes tells us that if the taking is through deceit for payment, it's unjust vexation because the element of violence is missing.
That is true, but let's look at the flip side. When someone uses force but claims they had the authority to do so, the good faith defense. This is surprisingly robust. In Timonor versus People, a mayor ordered a barbershop fenced off.
A literal fence.
A literal fence. This prevented the owner from doing business, a clear restriction of will, a clear financial loss, but the mayor was acting on the recommendation of a health officer who said the place was unsanitary.
And the court ruled it wasn't coercion.
Correct, because he acted in good faith performance of a duty. The authority of law is a defense. It suggests that coercion is only a crime when the restrainer acts outside the law.
I have to push back on that slightly. Authority of law is a valid defense for a public official, yes. But ownership is not a defense for a private citizen, and U.S. versus Mina is the counterpoint here.
The case of the pig?
The case of the pig. The accused was the true owner of a pig that someone else was holding. He didn't steal it, it was his pig. But he used violence to take it back. The court held that even if you have a right to the thing itself, you cannot compel someone to give it up via violence. The ownership does not justify the force. The law says go to court. It does not say take it back if you're strong enough.
That is a crucial distinction. Public duty grants some leeway. Private ownership grants none when it comes to force. It reinforces that the state demands a monopoly on the use of violence. But what about when the leverage isn't physical force but information? This brings us to the gray area of blackmail.
Technically, blackmail isn't a term you find explicitly in the Revised Penal Code headings, but we treat it under light threats, which is Article 283.
Yes, and this is where the condition I mentioned at the start becomes the ultimate weapon. In blackmail, the offender threatens a wrong that isn't a crime. For example, I will publish photos of you having an affair, or I will tell your boss you're looking for a new job.
Right. Exposing a secret isn't necessarily a crime. Telling the truth isn't a crime.
Exactly. But if I say, I will expose your secret unless you pay me money, that demand transforms a legal act into a crime.
That's a fascinating paradox. The act of exposing the truth is legal. The act of asking for money in a loan or gift is legal. But combine them, and you have Article 283.
It proves my core thesis again. The law punishes the intent to intimidate, combined with the imposition of a condition. The demand for money turns the threat of exposure into a weapon against the victim's security. The law is essentially saying you cannot monetize fear.
And I come at it from a different way. I view that as a form of unjust vexation that has been elevated because of the financial motive. Unjust vexation, under the second paragraph of Article 287, is the ultimate catch-all for acts that annoy or torment without violence. It's the bucket where we throw everything that doesn't quite fit into the other boxes.
It is often called the catch-all, but it requires nuance. It isn't just being annoying.
Well, consider People versus Climaco. This case always stands out to me. The offender kissed a girl and held her tight.
Without her consent.
Without her consent. Now, he didn't demand money, so no threat. The prosecutor couldn't prove lewd designs, so no acts of lasciviousness. And he didn't use violence to compel a specific act in the sense of coercion. So what was it? The court called it unjust vexation. It was an act that caused annoyance, irritation, and distress.
That case is the perfect illustration of how intent shapes the crime. If the prosecutor could have proved lewd designs, that kiss becomes a sexual crime. If the prosecutor could have proved a demand for money, I'll let you go if you pay me,
it becomes a threat or coercion. Because those specific intents were absent, the law defaults to protecting the victim from the vexation. It reinforces that we must look at what was in the mind of the offender.
And I would add, we must look at the result on the victim. The vexation is defined by the torment caused, whether it's a kiss or disrupting a religious procession or cutting off someone's electricity. If it doesn't fit the strict boxes of threat or coercion, unjust vexation is the law's way of saying you cannot simply torment people. It's a low bar, but a necessary one to keep civil peace.
We're nearing the end of our time, and I think we've illuminated a crucial tension in the law. From my perspective, the statutes regarding threats, specifically grave threats, prioritize the mental security of the victim. Whether it's a threat to kill with a condition or blackmail, the law penalizes the use of fear as leverage. The deliberate purpose to scare is the central evil. The consummation of the crime upon knowledge, as we saw in Villanueva, proves that the state wants to stop the fear before it even manifests into action.
And from my perspective, the statutes regarding coercion and the defenses involving anger prioritize the autonomy of the will and the reality of human behavior. Coercion is about the act of compulsion, making someone do what they do not want to do. The law is careful to distinguish this from the heat of anger in Article 285, where a temporary loss of control is forgiven as a light threat if not persisted in. The law acknowledges that not every scary word is a calculated crime.
I think we can agree that the legal system demands a microscopic examination of the offender's state of mind. Was it a flare of anger, or was it a calculated condition? Was it an assertion of authority, or vigilante justice?
Absolutely. And it demands an examination of the method. Was it violence, intimidation, or merely annoyance? The difference between prison time and a small fine often rests on whether a condition was imposed or whether the offender persisted in their threat.
So to our listeners, we leave you with this thought. While taking the law into one's own hands is strictly forbidden, the law is surprisingly nuanced when it comes to the heat of passion. But be warned, add a condition to your anger, and the law shows no mercy.
Indeed, anger may be a defense, but leverage is a crime.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Until next time.